All right, I have to start with a confession today. This week I got pulled over for speeding. Now, it has been since 1997 was the last time I got a speeding ticket. 17 years old. But this week, I got pulled over. And, that thing where you see it happen, you know it's coming, the lights are on behind you. I pulled off the road and turned off my car and closed my eyes. Said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." I needed it in that moment. We've been going over this Shema for a few weeks now. We've been looking at the words, the Hebrew words that Moses used as he spoke to the people of Israel as they were preparing to go into the promised land. And he was speaking to them and telling them to recite this and remember this and say it over and over again. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." We've looked at those words, Shema meaning hear, Yahweh, the name of God, the one who is, who always has been and always will be. And then we looked at the word love, recognizing that love comes from God. It's a part of His character. It's not just something He does, but it's who He is. And that loving God is really just reciprocating what God has already done for us. But it's also that love isn't just a feeling towards somebody, but God's love is not just in feeling, but in action. And the Hebrew people, the Israelites, as they heard from Moses, "Love the Lord your God," they understood that loving God was lived out in loving each other. Even the foreigners, those that are not like us. Loving God is to love each other. Brings us this week to the next word in the Shema, and that word is LEV, which means heart. But I've been, saying this to myself over and over again, and I've been using the version that Jesus used in Mark chapter 12 when the teacher asked him for the greatest commandment, and his response was to say the Shema, plus Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. I've been using that version of it, and saying it to myself, like when I get pulled over, or when something isn't going my way, or just any time it happens to come up. And my hope is that you have done that as well. And I had a couple people in the first service that said, "Yeah, we've learned it, we've been talking about it, we've been going over it to make sure that we remember it." This week one of my kids said, "I think I got it." And so then I started quizzing them, and all three of them were able to at least work their way through it to remember the Shema. I hope that you're working to do the same. To learn this thing that people of God have been reciting multiple times a day for thousands of years. But we also have to understand what it means, right? It helps to be able to recite it, but we have to understand what the intention was. And so when Moses says to the people of God, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart," what does He mean? Now, I have my initial kind of 21st century English version of what that means. I use we talk about our heart as the place where our emotions come from or how we feel towards somebody else. So, love God with my heart kind of makes sense to me. But is that what was intended when Moses spoke those words? Does that encapsulate everything it means to love God with my heart? Let's find out.
For thousands of years, every morning and evening, Jewish people have prayed these well-known words as a way of expressing their devotion to God. They're called the Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And as for you, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength." We're going to look at the fourth key word in this prayer, heart, which in Hebrew is sometimes pronounced levav, or more often in a shorter form, lev. Now, different cultures throughout history have had different conceptions of how the human body works, and this is also true of the ancient Israelite writers of the Bible. They knew that the heart was an organ in the chest that sustains life. There's mention of a heart attack in the Bible, Naval, whose heart died inside of him and he became like stone. But the biblical authors talk about the heart in many other ways that might seem strange to modern readers, and that's because these Israelites had no concept of the brain or any word for it. They imagined that all of a human's intellectual activity takes place in the heart. For example, you know with your heart in the Bible. Your heart is where you understand and make connections. In the book of Proverbs, wisdom dwells in the heart. And your heart is what you use to discern between truth and error, like Solomon did when he was king. So the heart is where you think and make sense of the world, and it's where you do more. In the Bible, the heart is where you feel emotions. You feel pain in your heart, like Hannah did when she couldn't have any children. In fact, the phrase "a broken heart" comes from ancient biblical Hebrew. You also experience fear in your heart. Your heart can melt or be distressed. Your heart can even be depressed. But then on the flip side, your heart is where you experience joy. In Hebrew, to be happy is to be good of heart, or to have a heart of joy. So the heart is the generator of physical life. It's also the center of your intellectual and emotional life, and there's more. In biblical Hebrew, the heart is where you make choices motivated by your desires. So David had it in his heart to build a temple for God. Your heart is where your affections are centered. They're called the desires of your heart. And if you really want something and go after it, it's like what Nathan said to David, whatever's in your heart, go and do it. So then, in the Bible, the heart is the center of all parts of human existence, as in the well-known proverb, guard your heart, because from it flows your whole life. Now, the prophet Jeremiah believed that the human heart was fundamentally broken. He said, the heart of a human is deceitful above all, irreversibly sick. Who can even understand it? He had watched a whole generation turn away from God. They started sacrificing their children as if that were a good thing. So this is why, in the imagination of the Hebrew prophets, the only hope for humanity is the total renewal of the human heart. Moses predicted that if Israel was ever going to love their God, their heart would need to be circumcised, which is a very vivid and surprising metaphor about removing evil and stubbornness from the human heart. David, after he committed murder and adultery, pleads with God to create in me a pure heart. The prophet Ezekiel hoped for a day when God would remove the heart of stone and give his people a new heart of soft flesh, which is very similar to Jeremiah's hope that God would write the commands of the Torah on the hearts of his people. And that brings us all the way back to the Shema. Every day, God's people are called to devote to God their whole body and mind, their feelings and their desires, their future and their failures. This is what it means to love the Lord your God with all of your heart.
So our heart is more than just our feelings, right? In the way that Moses talked about heart, it included much more. When I was talking to the kids, they knew right away, when we talk about our heart, what do we know? First of all, it sustains our life, right? And so if our heart stops, our life stops. And so, when the Hebrews heard, love the Lord your God with all your heart, they knew that meant all your body as well, right? And so, it wasn't just, this kind of emotional, lovey-dovey thinking when it comes to the heart, but they actually recognized that it was your body. So Moses didn't need to say, love the Lord your God with all your body, and with all your heart, and with all your soul, because they understood that that was included when he talked about the heart. They knew it was a physical, literal thing that sustained their lives. So love the Lord with your body. They knew that it was a part of our feelings, too. This is the closest part that really kind of meshes with the way we think of the heart in English today, which is loving God in our feelings, and so we can feel all these things in our heart. But here's what's kind of interesting. Not only, we talk about the heart as where pain can happen, where joy happens, where all these feelings happen, but it's not the deepest emotion. In fact, in Hebrew, what's interesting is, as they talked about, there's no word for mind. But there are a few times where you find that mind is translated in the Old Testament. You might find somewhere where it talks about the heart and the mind. And I was like, but there's supposed to not be a Hebrew word for mind, so that's weird. So I pulled out my little, Greek, Hebrew, English thing, and I start looking through it, and I see LEV, which is heart, but I get to mind, and I look up this word, and I can't say it for you because I don't know Hebrew. But I look it up, and it says my innermost being, but literally translated, your guts, your bowels. So actually, the way the Hebrews looked at it, you thought and you felt with your heart, but your deepest, most passionate, your most strong feelings came from your bowels, your gut. Kind of interesting. We use that today when we talk about when we have a gut feeling about something. We recognize that when I'm most stressed, it usually affects me in my gut, right? In my stomach. When I'm most anxious, when I'm most concerned. But what's funny to me is that kind of shifts the way when we really think strongly, when we really use the deepest emotion that we have, it's not our heart, but our guts. And so therefore, instead of saying, I love my wife with all of my heart, it really is better to tell her, and guys, I'm telling you, do it. I love you with all of my colon, is a much stronger way to go. But it is about our feelings too. We are invited to love God with our heart, and it's not just the body, it's also the feelings. And then it's the mind. There is no Hebrew word for mind, and so the heart is where they believed all of that came from. And of course now we know that physiologically all of that comes from our brain, right? It comes from up here. We don't actually feel with our hearts or our guts. But what our mind feels sometimes affects those things, right? But when Moses said this to the Israelites, they understood that this was not just about their feelings, not just about their bodies, but it was also about their minds. Now here's what's kind of cool about that to me. In the first century we have Jesus, and he comes across this teacher who asks him about the greatest commandment. And Jesus, I always kind of looked at this as well. It's kind of interesting. Jesus added to the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and then Jesus added your mind and your strength. Why would he do that? Well, what Jesus was doing is simply interpreting for the first century in a Roman culture that was very well influenced by Greek philosophy, that began to understand that your mind was involved in this too. He recognized that the people that are hearing him are not just going to understand automatically that the heart means my thinking. They're going to associate the heart with my feeling and the brain with my thinking, and therefore he interprets it for his people in his time. So it's not that Jesus really added anything. All he did was he made it a little more clear for the people that he was speaking to. Which is really what we're trying to do today. How do we understand what Moses said in a way that we can get all of it in our own interpretation, in our own context, in our own world? Love the Lord your God with all your heart. It meant loving with your body, with your feelings, with your mind, and that includes with my decision making. The things that I do, how do I love God with those? So how do we translate this for our culture and our world? Why does it matter today to say love the Lord with all your heart and really understand all aspects of what was meant by that in the Hebrew language? It's because we need to do the same things. You and I need to understand that when we're called to love God, that means loving God with my body. Sometimes we get ourselves caught up in kind of that Greek philosophy, sometimes even the kind of old Gnostic thinking where we have this like separate body and spirit, and like the spirit matters, the body doesn't. This is just this temporal kind of fleshly thing that we're going to get rid of eventually anyway. My true self is inside, right? We sometimes take that, but that's not a biblical perspective on the body. The body is created by God intentionally. It is sacred as something that God has made as he made each one of us. So we don't separate those things and say, the body's stupid, it's unnecessary, it's temporary, the spirit or the soul is what matters. No, we are called to love God with our bodies. The things I do with my body matters. And so I'm called to love him with that. That affects what I do for and to myself. Certainly when we think of areas of addiction, when we think of areas of sex, when we think of violence, when we think of all the different things that incorporate our bodies, He is calling us to love Him with our very bodies. Because our heart is a representation of that. Then, as we said, we are called to love Him with our feelings. Now, some of you, that comes really naturally. You can have that really natural kind of emotional connection. I love God with my heart. But some people struggle with that. And I think one of the best things for me is to go back and look at how Jesus referred to God, the Father. Because what it does is it gives me an emotional connection to who God is in my life as Father. Jesus taught us to call Him Father, to recognize God as Father. So if you have a good Father, you can say, look, He is a representation of this good relationship, somebody who loves me and has been there for me and has cared for me. And so God is just an even better representation of that. And that helps me to love Him with my feelings, with my heart in that way. For those that don't have a good Father, or who don't have a Father, what it does is it allows us to say, I haven't seen that and experienced that in this life, but there is one who is real and who is better, who is truly a Father to me, even when I didn't have one of my own. But we are called to love God with our feelings too, to experience Him, to know Him. Psalm 28 says, "Praise be to the Lord, for He has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusts Him, and He helps me. My heart leaps for joy, and with my song I praise Him." Or this week we were at Bethel Project, and Kevin Engelhart was giving us this message, and he reminded us of Psalm 34:8, where it says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in Him." When we love God with our heart, with our feelings, we experience Him. Sometimes in our music we have a chance. It gives us that opportunity to experience a love for God that outside of that is more difficult. And we have to be careful that we don't only love God with our feelings, but it is a part of how we love God. And then just as they were called to love God with their mind and their decisions, so are you and I. We are called to love God with our minds and our decisions, to choose Him continually, to use our brains to understand and to know Him, to learn who He is. Not just to experience Him, not just to love Him with our feelings, but to really know about Him, to study and understand, so that our minds can be engaged in our love for God as well. As Romans 12:1 talks about worship, it says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." And verse 2, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." We add the knowledge of God to the experience of God when we love Him. We seek Him out. He doesn't invite us. He doesn't call us to have ignorant faith. He calls us to have intelligent faith. That's why we're doing this Shema study, because we need to not just read it and go, well, I understand it. We need to actually care enough, love God enough to learn what His intention for us is as we love Him with our mind and with our decisions. When Moses said to love with your heart, he meant it. Love with your body, love with your emotion, love with your mind, love with your decisions. That is the part of the Shema as He calls us. Love the Lord your God